Well, welcome everyone. We'll just wait a minute or so for everyone to start filing into this virtual very large room that we're going to be in. So just hold on for a few minutes. And it is fascinating sitting here watching the number of participants go up. Hello, 392 of you. Hello, 433 of you. I think I'll stop there. And thank you, whoever said hello back. Well, as we're all filing in, I'll start talking. So I'm Simon Ricketts from Town Legal. Welcome everyone to this Town Legal and Number 5 Chambers event on the likely practical implications of the Planning for the Future white paper. It really is great to have so many of you here in the depths of August. So 1 week on from the publication of the white paper, there's still a huge amount of interest as to what's likely to result in practice from these proposals. So, you know, many of you have registered for today's session panel. There really is no pressure, but people, you know, in my view, looking for practical pointers. This is a hugely ambitious document, in fact, 2 documents, given the accompanying consultation over shorter term measures. And there's every indication that the government will be looking to drive forward quickly after the consultation period that on the main document ends on the 29th of October. And driving forward means primary legislation, a lot of secondary legislation, a whole lot of guidance and a lot more besides. So as soon as we're over Brexit, it will be on to Plexit, which I've trademarked Duncan just now. Rather than debate the rights and wrongs of it all, I'm really keen that we try to root the discussion today in practicalities. So, you know, what could this new system look like? How would it work? And how do we plan for it from a variety of perspectives, whether you're a landowner, investor, developer, consultant, lawyer, local authority, community. In the interest of time, we're going to assume that you've read the proposals, or at least the many good summaries out there. We've got a fantastic hand-picked panel, and I'll go through them one by one very quickly. First of all, the man who never sleeps and who these days always has planning news for us. Indeed, we've pinched your show's spot this week, Chris Young, barrister. Hi, Chris. Secondly, the man, afternoon in my time zone, but the man who used to be known as, best known as the government's former chief planner, but who I know better now as my wise colleague, Steve Quartermain. So hello, Steve. Then the woman who is the country's leading authority on strategic planning, as far as I'm concerned. And when younger, she must have been amazing at those sort of join the dots puzzles. Duncan and I knew her when she was Director of Planning at our then client, Sierra. She was responsible at Surrey for the last Surrey structure plan. Those were the days. Catriona Riddell. Hi, Catriona.
Evening.
All-round brain box, fellow town partner, Duncan Field. Just hold off the gifts for this afternoon. Hello, Duncan.
I'll try.
Try hard, please. And then top junior barrister, familiar face around the table at local plan examinations and Section 78 appeals. You want her on your side of the table rather than the other side, I suspect. Thea Osmund-Smith. Hi, hi, Thea.
Hi.
And then Gordon Adams. Now, Gordon wears a number of hats. He studied planning at university in Australia before spending 4 years working in the New South Wales zonal planning system. He knows about that. He's currently head of planning at Battersea Power Station Development Company, 10 million square feet regeneration project. He knows about major projects. Before that job, he was team leader for major applications at Southwark Council, where he acted on schemes such as the Shard and the redevelopment of London Bridge Station. He sees the public authority side of things. He also sits on the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, so brings a variety of perspectives. So that's the panel today. I'll be a sort of player manager, chairing, but chipping in as well if they'll let me. A few housekeeping points to note. Your microphones are automatically muted, so you won't need to adjust your local settings. We can't hear you no matter how loud you shout at the screen. We very much welcome questions through the session, through the Q&A function. From experience of previous sessions, there are so many questions. We try to pick up on the themes and specific questions. We may come back to you afterwards. This webinar will be recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording session tomorrow afternoon about this time. And if you lose connection at any point in the webinar, just use the same link to rejoin. So that was all I needed to say by way of introduction. We really need to get into the meat of this, and it's going to be a sort of structured discussion where we try to hit upon the main questions that we've all got. And I think one of the fundamental questions is really for you, Chris, to begin on, which is, you know, in this new system, how are housing numbers and other development requirements going to be set, and what are the implications of the new standard methodology that's being consulted upon?
Okay, so thank you very much, Simon. Housing numbers, these are what drive forward planning completely. They're the main element of any plan. They drive the greatest number of allocations anywhere outside of a major city, and the resultant sites are almost uniquely contentious compared with everything else. Presently, we have a system where the housing requirement is set in the local plan. It should be based on the standard method. The figure can be used, but LPAs can argue and submit evidence that it should be higher or lower. Lower because of constraints like Greenbelt, higher because they want to pursue regeneration or they want to pursue economic growth and have the housing to match that. Subject to independent review, as we know, by inspectors, although the extent to which they are allowed to really challenge it is constrained by ministers having said they should be pragmatic. The figure's good for 5 years, and after that, it needs to be reviewed or a new local plan introduced. What's the new system? Well, as far as that process is concerned, there is only one change. The system will continue to be based on a standard method figure. It will continue to be based on a revision to that standard method figure, either upwards or downwards, downwards because of constraint, up because of regeneration, etc. So it all looks incredibly similar. However, the key change is this. The government will set the figure. The local authority will not be able to set the figure. And so there will inevitably be a process whereby there's lobbying by the local authority to suggest that their figure should be lower. So let's take an example, Bromley. Bromley never touched their Greenbelt. So they've got a plan that has 641 a year. They are going to have to make their case to say it should stay at 641 rather than the standard method figure, which is now 2,500 a year. So the process only changes. Now, the key interesting point is how that process going to work. That detail is not in the white paper. The detail will not involve an examination process. There may be some form of regional structure that comes in, but that's extremely difficult for the Conservative Party to promote. And so I think what we're going to see is a move to a lot more of a county-based approach. I think we'll see the movement towards single unitary authorities, and that ties in with what the government has planned for devolution. And I think at a county level, whilst it's not as good as a regional level, you're going to see county plans operating, county-wide plans for a joint combined authority, unitary authority, because that at least does give you the opportunity to put housing outside of constrained areas and make all authorities in that county, which is now one authority, responsible for the outcome. What I worry about, if I'm honest, is too much political lobbying. We're moving to an increasingly political system. Just look at the proposals for the Supreme Court. And is it going to be a case of piling it all into cities that may not be able to achieve those figures, which are controlled by Labour, and not have the numbers in the county rural areas where the demand is highest? What is interesting, though, is they haven't shied away from huge numbers in areas of high demand. That's what's really interesting. I won't go through the whole new standard method, but what the new standard method does is replace the household projections, which, as we all know, have baked in suppressed household formation, so they're close to pointless in terms of what the level of need is. Instead, although they can be used, it's the higher of either that figure or 0.5% increase a year in stock. And then, interestingly, 2 affordability adjustments. Now, if that remains in there, that produces absolutely enormous numbers across southern England and in London. London's figure, 93,000 homes a year. Incredible, never been done. And that's why it's difficult to see this working without some degree of strategic cooperation, unless it's going to be an entirely politicised process in which Lewisham and all the inner boroughs are given huge figures. My observation, when he was mayor, Boris Johnson promoted a plan that put huge numbers in the inner boroughs and kept the numbers in the outer boroughs constrained. The new mayor has much higher figures in the outer boroughs. It's obviously been a source of much contention, but how do you resolve that? I think what I would like to see is that if there is a process whereby there is the lobbying by local authorities of their number, that is transparent, that the development industry is involved. And my number one observation to developers and to land promoters and to house builders is to demand a process which is transparent about what the number for Bromley and everywhere else should be. There needs to be transparency and the ability to make representations in that process. What does it mean for the next application? Well, this is going to take time. Bromley have just adopted a plan, just to take them as an example, that they're going to hang on to that 641 for a year. This process is going to take time. What we don't know is when the government are going to hand out the figures, and crucially, we don't know whether they're going to say existing plans are very soon out of date, to the point where you need to swap to the standard methodology. And if the standard methodology is the appropriate figure, that opens a can of worms, which others are going to talk about 5-year land supply being replaced by a deliverability test, not delivery test, housing delivery test rather than deliverability. So those are my thoughts. It's not going to immediately kick in because it's going to have to go into local plans. We don't have a lot of the details, Simon, to be honest.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Chris. I mean, Catriona, what's your take on this from your background?
Well, I think, as we all know, that the numbers game is probably the most difficult part of the process and the most challenging part of the process politically. The bigger the area you have, as mentioned, the bigger the spatial canvas, the easier, I guess, the distribution is going to be. If you take places like Surrey, 74% of Surrey's greenbelt, that's a huge amount that would come under, in theory, under the government's new system as restricted, yet it is probably one of the most least affordable places in the country, and the figures there are already significantly high under the standard methodology. So I think the bigger the area that you take, and I think a lot of people are advocating return to regional planning, maybe not on that scale, but certainly some form of strategic planning to actually help look at that broader spatial canvas, look at where the growth areas are going to be. And I think the disappointing thing in all of this is there is nothing that refers to vision or ambition. There's nothing in there that says, when we look at the housing numbers, that sort of stage 2 process that Chris has alluded to, there's nothing in there that says we'll take into account what your ambition for an area is. How transformational do you want to be as an area? So again, looking at places like South Essex, they've really struggled to even meet their current needs, but they have got really strong ambitions to be transformational, really grow that part of the country. So how do you take that into account in terms of these housing numbers? And I don't think that the answer's there. You can't simply do it by formula. You can't do it through some form of computer program, because these are things that are set through the local area around that long-term vision and ambition. So I think we need to find something somehow, you know, that fits in, and have the sort of governance structure to support that. I think the other part of that is it's not just about the constraints, it's about the economic strategies in these areas. It's about, you know, what are the LIPs saying, what are the subnational transport bodies saying about strategic infrastructure investment, and how will all that play out in terms of these numbers right across the country. It is interesting that the government are appointing new place, I think the head of place for what they're calling regions, and there's a few appointments coming out. So maybe that's the way they're going to do it. They're going to actually start going back to regional offices and use these civil servants to take all that into account.
Yeah, no, thanks, Catriona. And I just saw, you know, someone asked the changes to the standard method. Well, when are they going to kick in? And I was just, the shorter term measures consultation document says that following the outcome of this consultation, and the deadline for that is the 1st of October, the government will update the planning practice guidance with the revised standard method for assessing local housing needs. So it's interesting that we're going to have to grapple with the new standard method pretty quickly, it seems to me, under the existing system, and then, you know, how it's going to work moving forward. You know, Thea, from your perspective as advocate at local, you know, plan examinations, you know, how do you see this playing out, maybe in the short term, but also, you know, fundamentally in the longer term, when you're not going to be able to have those battles over, you know, what housing number should be in the plan?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably a good news for adopting a plan quickly that we're not going to be having those battles at examination. I mean, we've got this sort of incredibly quick timetable for plan making now. That's 30 months from start to finish, in contrast with the 7 years that it's taking at present to get a plan adopted. Now, it's important to note that that timetable is proposed to be a statutory timetable, so it's not discretionary for local planning authorities. It's not even guidance, you know, take as long as you need. It's 30 months, and there may well be penalties or sanctions imposed for local planning authorities that don't play along with that, albeit the penalties at the moment seem to be the government telling them to do what they should be doing. So terrifying, I know, but perhaps not really a stick to beat them with. But essentially, the proposals for the examination and scrutiny of plans flow from that timetable, because there will not be the time to do all of the consultation that we have at present. So issues and options, and then we might have consultation on preferred options for the strategy and sites, and then sometimes consultation on the draft plan, and then of course on the pre-submission draft as well. And we're not going to have those levels of consultation that we've all previously been engaged in. Now, at stage 1 at the moment, the local planning authority, we're told, has got 6 months to call for suggestions for the areas under the 3 categories that are set out. So a call for sites exercise basically, and very little else. There's not very much in the white paper so far as I can see in relation to spatial strategy, vision, ambition for the plan area. And I think that's one of the points that Catriona's made, that we have a real strong focus on numbers and delivery of housing, but not really much consideration of the broader issues. Stage 2, that's when the local planning authority spends 12 months drafting the plan and gathering the evidence, but not completing the sustainability appraisal, so they can breathe a sigh of relief about that. But undoubtedly, they're still going to have to show that the sites or areas allocated are sustainable, a term which is apparently well understood. Now, the first time anyone is actually consulted on the draft proposals is at stage 3. And that's when the plan is submitted to the inspectorate with the local planning authority's statement of reasons. Now, there appears to be no consultation on options or alternatives throughout the process, which of course is the cornerstone of sustainability appraisal, and no consultation on a draft for stakeholders to inform detailed plan preparation. So forgive me, if this process was intended to allow communities to engage meaningfully in shaping plans, I think it could well fail in that aim. Stakeholders may well feel that they've been presented with a fait accompli at stage 3, because that's the first time that there's a draft plan that anyone actually has an opportunity to comment on. Now, I think there's a big issue with that. And it's this, that if there are serious and valid objections to the plan as drafted, the local planning authority isn't going to know about it until it's submitted for examination. And what happens then if a convincing case is made that a large growth area, for example, is unsustainable? Is that something that the local planning authority can remedy at that stage of the process? Or are they going to be then forced to go back to the drawing board and face intervention in whatever form that might take? Now, going forward, we're told that there won't be any legal duties of sustainability appraisal, and of course we know duty to cooperate has gone. And those are things which often trip plans up and mean they have to go back to the drawing board when, of course, they were so close to the finish line. And as I've said, no debate with housing numbers, that's all great. And those things won't be derailing plans. But as I've said, I think there is the potential for such late stage consultation to have the same effect if large growth areas are objected to and objected to well by local people. So the big practical message here, I think, is for anyone wanting to engage with a plan, they really have to do so at the outset. If you've got a site, there's one opportunity to promote it, and that's stage one, and you'll really be needing to be ready to go at that stage. I would be providing evidence to support the sustainability and deliverability of the site at that stage, and really making life easy for the local planning authority, because you're not going to be able to come in at later stages of consultation and argue that your site is a better option. Now, the white paper proposes a slimmed down test for deliverability, and I confess I don't really understand what that means, especially if you have a local plan that effectively is going to be granting outline approval for growth areas. Surely in those circumstances, an understanding of whether the site or area is deliverable is pretty important. It seems counterintuitive to me to do away with the test when the white paper considers that the proposal should ensure sufficient certainty, and that's the words that the white paper uses, sufficient certainty about land availability to ensure that the supply will be adequate. And that's the reason for doing away with a 5-year housing land supply. But if you're going to have confidence in the plan, you need to know that development can come forward in a reasonable timescale, and very much of that has to do with demonstrating deliverability at an early stage in the process.
Thank you. Someone just asked about, viability, and do we see that deliverability will bring with it the need to test viability in the same way as before?
Well, I guess we'll come on to talk about viability and the new infrastructure levy and how that's all going to work in due course. But yeah, of course, viability is a key plank of whether a site or not a site's going to come forward. And it's something that we need to know. So, of course, a slimmed down test of deliverability can be useful. We've seen garden communities fail, perhaps a little bit unfairly, we might think, because of the requirements to show that they're deliverable in a number of ways at the plan making stage. But if the plan is going to provide a framework with some reasonable level of certainty going forward for development, and we know that development outside of the local plan should only come forward in exceptional circumstances, that's the proposal, then we need to know that plans are going to be delivering, and they're going to be delivering in a timely way.
Yeah. It seems to me that given this idea of dividing areas within plans into growth areas, renewal areas, protection areas for protection. If you're a landowner and wanting your area, your land designated for growth, then and to achieve the equivalent of outline planning permission, then there's probably quite a lot of preparation that you're going to need to help the authority with and feed into that process, which I think probably takes us on to Duncan, really, doesn't it, Duncan, in terms of the consenting routes that will now be available for people promoting development.
Yeah, I'm tempted to borrow a phrase that was never actually uttered in Star Trek, but featured in that annoying song Star Trekking from the 1980s. And, it's development management, but not as we know it. Why do I say that? Well, because actually nearly all the consenting routes that we know and love or hate now would still be available. But it's not quite the same because of the onus that's now being placed on the local plan, granting outline planning permission through allocation of a growth area, giving rise to a statutory presumption of development in relation to allocation of a renewal area. And so the move with that sort of principle in place, the move in development management is away from a discretionary-based system, more towards a compliance-based system with design codes and guidance set out in the local plan. And I think if that is achievable, you can readily see how the development management system could speed up. Those statutory periods for determination might actually start to mean something. We could have more standardized documentation, which is a suggestion in the white paper, less consultation at application stage and less involvement of councillors, which is again mooted in the white paper. I suppose the one thing that concerns me is, cultural change. Retaining the existing consenting routes with which we're all familiar, does mean that we're going to have to make quite a mental leap into a new system and not expect our applications to be treated in the same way, or stakeholders getting used to the fact that perhaps they won't have as much influence at the application stage. And also, I think complexity. One thing that troubles me about the passage in the white paper is, whilst I think the concept is good and could, we could streamline quite a lot of the system that we have at the moment. The grafting on the consenting routes to the principle of the primacy of the development plan is problematic. For example, if you have a growth area and that gives you outline planning permission, why on earth, as the white paper suggests, would you then contemplate embarking on a local development order or even a development consent order? That just seems to me to take away from the principle of what the white paper is trying to do. Far better just to say that all those consenting routes will remain available in other circumstances, and they can be used as and when needed.
Yeah, no, really interesting. So I suppose, Steve, to bring you in, and before we talk about this focus on design and beauty and the role that communities would have in this process, someone was trying to flatter you, I think, by asking the question as to what extent is this new system a construct of COVID, or has this package been in development for a longer period of time, including when your steady hand was on the tiller? I don't know if you want to address that or go straight to.
Well, thanks. Hello, everybody. I mean, I think that the white paper is full of big ideas, and I think that some of them, in truth, have been quite a while in gestation. So it is true that I can recognise some things that have come through the white paper that were being talked about and developed whilst I was in the department. And to be fair, even some of those that weren't actually developed were being talked about when I was in there. They just haven't actually come forward as particular proposals. But it is interesting, isn't it? We're all talking about the white paper and picking up ideas within it and thinking that this is an idea that might have legs. But in all cases, we're sort of struggling to sort of say, well, actually, how does this work? And all of us who are practitioners who are trying to, and to be frank, the civil servants who have to write the legislation, have got to ask themselves, well, this might be a good idea, but how do we make it work? How does it actually play out, and how do we deliver on it? And I think that that's exactly the case when I'm talking about, say, the design, and I see someone's already asked a question about neighbourhood plans. It's great to see that the white paper still embeds the sort of government's ambition for good design and trying to pick up some of the building better, building beautiful stuff, although there's a full report promise later in the year. There's a promise of national codes, design codes. There's a promise of which will build upon guidance. There's a promise of sort of a regional approach. The local councils have their own codes. There's a promise that provably popular designs will get built. A phrase which is used twice in the white paper, I think, but lifted directly from the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commissioner's report. And the neighbourhood planning, proposal 9, 3 short chapters, 3 short paragraphs, which rather suggests that they, in the haste to get the white paper out, they suddenly remembered neighbourhood planning and said, oh yeah, we must get back to you on this, and we'll do some more work on how that all fits in the future. The idea that the growth and renewal areas will have a fast track approval route where sort of design codes exist and where people have agreed a master plan is also something we've talked about for a while. But in the challenge that we all sort of face is, well, how does that actually work? Then you start thinking, well, okay, how do you actually ensure that you've got design codes from, I don't know, Carlisle to Cambridge or Carlisle to Manchester? Now, everyone's going to have a locally produced design code. The national code will be the default if you don't have one. So if you don't have your local one, it will be the national code that binds. How does this happen? And picking up Thea's earlier point about community engagement. Well, we've already heard about community engagement with the actual plan making and the numbers and the like. It's clear that they envisage that the design codes will be done with community engagement. Well, I'm not entirely sure how long they think this is going to take in a timetable that says the whole plan's got to be done in 30 months. And you know, from my own experience when I was in local government, engaging with the community, one of the first things you learn is that you need to set aside enough time. And even if we digitize this process, it will take time to do. And I'm not entirely sure where the provably popular decision lands. I mean, house builders always used to tell me that their designs were provably popular because the purchasers wouldn't buy them if they didn't like them. So is it provably popular by the purchasers, or is it provably popular by the person who lives next door who doesn't like the design of the house that's adjacent? So where does that decision take place? Who's provably popular are we talking about here? It sounds like we're talking about existing communities sort of deciding what they think should be fitting in their community. And I worry a bit about innovation and the way in which designs of houses have come on. And I think that you know, we can, if we're not careful, stifle that sort of thing. It's great that they're thinking about a regional body on design, and you know, is that the re-emergence of CABE, and just sort of during my time as chief planner, I saw the minister bring an end to top-down figures, and now as I leave, I see a minister talking about reintroducing them. That same minister did away with top-down figures, did away with CABE. Do we now have a minister that's going to bring back a body that's going to be called something similar? And when I come to neighbourhood planning, there's a suggestion in the design bit and in neighbourhood planning that these have a role. They don't define what that role is or how they should do it, whether it should be focused on specific designs. But if you've already allocated a site and got a master plan and locally made design codes, what influence a community is going to have, unless they have a way of actually influencing that in the first place, which then means that I'm not sure what role the neighbourhood planning route is going to have. And there is an issue about street by street. A street can have its own particular design code. Well, given the amount of time it's taken for neighbourhood plans to go through the system, then we need to understand how that sort of approach will actually deliver sorts of codes and design approaches, provably popular approaches at that sort of level in a timescale that's going to fit in with the fact that we want to build. So I suppose my question is, what does this mean for localism in reality? Is localism gone? And I think one of the things that I would urge that people should reflect on in responding to the white paper is to try and make sure that isn't the case, and try and make sure that communities do still have a role to play in this new process. And I suppose, you know, I recognise it's rare that there's a consensus in planning, isn't it? There's always somebody that's you know, not happy. Even planning committees, when they vote something through, is, you know, it might be, you know, 8-4. There's still 4 people who didn't think it was okay, and that's the nature of the decisions that we tend to take. But finally, it's great that they want to see a chief officer level post, which is again something that's had quite a long tail, going back into time, saying if you want this agenda, you need to try and make someone responsible for delivering it. And this idea of a chief officer of design and placemaking is absolutely fantastic. But again, slight thing about how do you do this? There's a promise of a review of resources and skills in the white paper. If that review of resources and skills doesn't bring forward the funding for a chief placemaker and design, and the funding for the resources in the planning system to do the design codes, to do the master planning, then some of this is going to be more difficult to deliver in practical terms.
Yeah. So, Chris, to put you on the spot, I saw the thumbs going up. I saw the you agreeing with some of Steve's comments about provably popular designs and the role of neighbourhoods, etc. I don't know if you wanted to come in and.
I mean, you know, we live in a market economy. The housing market delivers things that people want. Okay, so all this great idea that we're going to have Georgian mansions, you know, filling the English countryside, just completely ridiculous. What people want is a driveway. They want a garage to put all their gear in, but not the car. And they want a detached house because they don't want to hear their neighbours through the wall. You know, don't tell people what they want. The house builders know. My own view, a very interesting observation, Steve. My own view is that localism could be positive, but has been generally negative. What's gone wrong is that neighbourhood plans have stuck their nose into housing numbers where they should not go. And they've been adopted ahead of local plans, which is just, in my view, ludicrous. And they should keep out of that. Where they could make a positive role and where they should do, in line with this new agenda, is setting design standards, setting what is appropriate to that community. I think that's where neighbourhood planning could contribute positively on this new white paper. Please, please don't let local parish councils decide what they think the appropriate housing number is.
Well, that certainly spurred a bit of comment on the chat both ways, I must say. We may come back to that. So Gordon, we've spoken a lot about, I think, probably issues outside of London and maybe away from the sort of major opportunity areas in London and the big cities. I mean, what's your perspective on this? I know you're an enthusiast for a lot of what the white paper proposes.
Yeah. Well, first to say, I'm very excited. As a planner, it's not often you have such a high degree of coverage in the Sunday papers. So, and as a general point, I am excited at the prospect of reform, given that you're right. My perspective is primarily from a London base at the moment. But what's consistent is I might work for a developer at the moment, but I am a planner, and all my career has been at the delivery end of planning. So after all the sort of plan making aspect has gone through. And when I first heard the prospect of zoning, I was slightly worried because as you mentioned in the intro, I learnt planning in New South Wales, which has a very strict zoning process. And it was very frustrating because there would be prohibited uses that you couldn't get around, which meant it was very box ticking. So when I got to the UK, my favourite line in the planning legislation is planning should be in accordance with development plan unless material considerations dictate otherwise. And so I felt that was better planning. But just as a general point, my criticism of the current system has been primarily focused on mission creep, in that more things are being put into a system that had functioned but was becoming unwieldy as it tried to be the solution to everything and then was becoming the problem. So on that basis, as a point on reform generally, I'm a fan, because I spend my days trying to get things through the system, which I think is despite the system, not because of it. And so in terms of what the white paper is proposing, a few things that really jump out to me. One is reducing the time of local plan preparation. Even as a planner, I just look on at the length of time it takes to get local plans through, and I'm just with despair. And whether that's local authorities or even the London plan, which I think Jules Pipe rolls his eyes in advance every time I go to ask a question. But there is, I think, A, it takes too long, and B, there is too much in them. So I think the proposals to simplify that, shorten that, has to be a good thing. And also because even as a planner, I look at some things and I find them sort of a bit much to try and understand. So the person on the street must have zero chance. But I think there is a tension, and it's been picked up. Housing numbers is not my area, but I understood the arguments Chris was making. And I think there is a tension between that sort of top-down instruction on numbers with local codes. They're completely opposite, and there will be a tension there. I think also, speaking as a developer, I think anything that has certainty is helpful. I think that is good. If you want to do what the code says, and that, you can make that stack up and everything, then happy days, there is that. And I shared Steve's concern I did have a concern, and Steve picked up on it about innovation, in that was my concern, is that there wouldn't be the ability to do something that the code didn't assume. But the paper has said that there will be the option of effectively like an opt-out, where you come along, it's like that unless material considerations dictate otherwise, where you come along and propose something that isn't in accordance with the plan or the code. If everyone thinks it's a good idea, it can still be approved. And to me, that is good planning. And something I think maybe Chris picked up on as well is sort of the role of councillors and that sort of thing. I think there is also a tension there in terms of the level of democracy involved. And to be honest, I haven't come to a conclusion yet. I sometimes think that the best way to ensure planning and delivery, etc., is just to take councillors completely out of the system. But then where's the accountability? So that's an unresolved one for me. And then I think that the last thing is just the is ensuring that that there isn't an excess in the system, because literally just before this panel, we're about to do another amendment to our application, which the section 73 and section 96A was brought in to make things easier, and it's just as much work and just as much expense, and quite often we sit down and we think, can any of us remember what we're proposing to build, because we're just stuck in process. And I'm certainly a planner who gets a kick out of seeing things built. I want to see things happen. So the system that can be amended to make that easier, I can only be supportive of.
No, thanks, Gordon. I'm sure lots of those viewing would share some of those views. I just wanted to cover now the other main area within the white paper, which is about money, which is about the infrastructure levy, what's going to happen with Section 106, and what is going to happen with a delivery of affordable housing. So, Duncan, do you want to lead off with some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in a short sentence, a lot of change and not a lot of detail is, I think, what I'd say. It's clear that Section 106 and SIL go. Yay! Long been hoping that would happen one day. And in its place, we have this, tax. Well, really, it's not called this, but tax on development value. And I think that has some attraction in terms of simplicity, although wait for the tax legislation. Simplicity and certainty, and to tax a development at that end of the process is probably a good thing as well, at least from a developer's perspective. But I do think it conceals, a lot of detail, and that will have to be worked through, and I'm sure it's government's intention to work through it. But just to highlight, on any given development, whether a development comes forward or not, is contingent on viability, and the government is saying it wants to get away from site viability and negotiation. But you've still got to look at land value, you still got to look at build costs, and you still got to look at development profit. And all those three things are very often site specific and vary locally. So arriving at the right, take or percentage of development value for the levy is going to be incredibly difficult, I think, and needs a lot of fleshing out. In principle, the simplicity of the idea, I think, is very attractive. I think as part of the consultation response, there's a lot of work that's going to be needed from the industry to help government get across the line on delivering it.
Yeah. Catriona.
Yeah, could I just ask a question about that? I think one of the issues for me around this is that there's been a lot of debate around SIL and who it goes to, whether it goes to the local planning authority, and nearly half of England is still covered at the moment by two-tier authorities, and that may well change as a result of local government restructuring and the devolution agenda, which we're waiting to see what that will say. But one of the issues is how then do the counties that deal with a huge proportion of the sort of place-based, the things that support long-term based growth, the education, the transport, a lot of the activities they do now, they have to negotiate, pretty much fight for everything they get if it comes through developer contributions. So if you've got a very large unitary under local government restructuring, then that might not be an issue, because they're the local planning authority, and they in theory would get all the money. And we know that in combined authority areas, it seems to be saying that they will still have an ability to get some funding, and there may be growth deals, I guess, on the table that will provide some funding for strategic infrastructure. But without all that, how does this sort of the two-tier work in this new system, Duncan?
I mean, I think the white paper is again short on detail on that, but I guess you would, on the basis that those the receipts of the infrastructure levy go to the local planning authorities, the upper tier, I suppose, would act as some kind of ringmaster for trying to coordinate cross-boundary strategic infrastructure. And, of course, that depends on cooperation and participation, which sort of plays into the local plan discussion that we've had already. I mean, I suppose the advantage of it is that, government, is also saying local authorities can borrow against anticipated receipts, and those receipts should be more predictable. So that element of certainty and predictability might facilitate that kind of, ringmaster approach and coordination of funds.
And in that case, I guess then the more a group of local authorities can get together, whether it's county-based, and I think it's back to what Chris was saying about, are we looking at county geographies coming back for divvying up the housing numbers, but actually are we looking at a much stronger approach to strategic infrastructure and spatial strategies, maybe non-statutory, maybe something that actually sets what the long-term strategic infrastructure requirements are, how they're going to be used to deliver the growth in areas, and that may be the mechanism by which the counties and others actually access some of this funding.
Yes, I mean, it seems to me that there's probably little alternative to something like that. I suppose, question mark, given that, and Simon raised this in the intro, given that this infrastructure levy will be funding affordable housing, and if it funds affordable housing, it will often be in-kind delivery, question how much of that infrastructure levy will be left over for strategic infrastructure.
Well, I share that sort of question, Duncan, and what I would say is generally I tend not to talk about still because I get upset and emotional. Because I think what's being proposed is a good idea in theory, but still was a good idea in theory, and certainly from our perspective, my 106 had one page for £211 million worth of Section 106 payments, and I now have 24 pages of algebra trying to get around bill implications. And so the proposals to have a low flat rate and simplify are good in theory, but from what I understand from the paper, it's saying that it's calculated towards the end, once the values are known, so good in theory. That it's payable prior to occupation, because that means that it helps cash flow, so you can generate the income to pay for it, good in theory. But then it also goes on to say that it will include affordable housing, but they also want to have the option for on-site delivery. And then there's an inherent tension in there, because if everything's done at the end, you've run out of time to deliver on-site. So I think there's quite a lot to sort of unravel there in the detail of how you can have that system also deliver on-site affordable housing.
I think there is a proposal to estimate development value at the outset, which may be a partial answer to that, but that needs a lot of supervision, I would imagine, because if you subsequently have big increases in development value or even big decreases in development value, then where does that leave the developer?
Yeah. And Duncan, the other thing that's not covered in the paper really in any detail is how the other elements that are usually dealt with by way of Section 106 are going to be addressed. Site-specific mitigation, education, everything like that. That seems to be fleshed out, I think.
Yeah, that is the case, but it's difficult to see how you will be able to avoid having some kind of delivery agreement still with the local authority, maybe around use of the infrastructure levy, or development funds for site-specific issues, which might be treated as in-kind payment. Yeah.
So I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the sort of, you know, getting from here, our current system, to there, the new system, because what the white paper says is that they want new plans to be adopted by the end of this Parliament. So that's by May 24. You know, 30 months to do that. That really means legislation on statute book by next year. That's going at some. But I think that's what, you know, we've got to expect, that there'll be sort of early in 2021, I assume. But to my mind, we set that alongside the consultation, which is going to start in the autumn, which was flagged by Environment Secretary on 20th of July into EU-derived environmental legislation. So we flagged that there was going to be a review of, for example, the operation of strategic environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment, to see whether the objectives of the international treaties that lie behind the EU directives can be discharged in a way which is more straightforward in terms of both plan making and decision making. That's also, of course, picked up in this white paper, and a lot of the timescales, it seems to me, are predicated on that you know, that review. So what I'm saying is, you know, we haven't just got the white paper, we've got a really important review kicking off in the autumn into EU-derived environmental legislation. We've also got, and you know, I don't know whether, you know, you want to say something about this later or now, Catriona, but we've got, you know, clearly further proposals about English devolution, on which much of this is possibly predicated. We've got the government's independent review of judicial review, which, whilst not directly referred to in this white paper, is another, you know, strand, I think, of making sure that trying to make sure that processes can work more straightforwardly. And, you know, there's the question mark over whether that's going to mean constraining or codifying in any way the ability to challenge decisions taken by planning authorities. And we've got the, you know, fairly short-term timescales for the introduction of first homes, the temporary threshold being raised to 40 or 50 homes for when the requirement to provide affordable housing kicks in for SMEs. So there's quite a bit coming on stream quite quickly, and I don't know whether anyone wants to say anything about, you know, how as a promoter of schemes, and maybe I'll, you know, look to you, Chris, but you know, when you're advising a promoter now, given this uncertainty across all of these strands, I mean, how do you start to unpack it? You know, what's the advice?
First things first, keep calm. Secondly, carry on. Okay, it's not going to change that quickly. If we have learned one thing in the time that I have been doing planning, it's that when the representative for the Regional Assembly of the East Midlands said to me at a local plan in 2004, the LDF process will all be in place by 2007. And I said, well, that'll be a triumph of hope over experience. He said, oh no, it's all going to be sorted by 2007. So look at a system that will take 10 to 15 years to come in. And that's probably realistic. I mean, let's look at it from the perspective of a developer with an appeal. But first of all, the standard method is going through the consultation process. So we've got to await the consultation to finish. That's 2 months. Then we've got another period by which the government should be conscientiously, under the law, considering the consultation responses. And then maybe it will be introduced later in this year. What we don't know, and it may be explained in the new MPPF, is what's the timescale for that new standard method to apply? Is it going to kick in immediately? in other words, have no transitional arrangements, and that's how you measure the authority's performance. Is it going to kick in after 5 years, or is it going to kick in when a local plan is adopted? So until we know, and then the current provision is 5 years, and then your housing numbers are out of date. Until we know that detail in the revised MPPF, whenever that comes out, we won't know what the effect is. Let's imagine the consultation happens on the standard method independent of a new MPPF. So because, as you said, it's a separate consultation on the current system, then it won't kick in for 5 years from the adoption of a plan. So Bromley have just adopted their plan. It's not going to affect them for 5 years. And then there'll be the resistance after that. You know that I've had an appeal result, successful appeal result this week in Chorley for Gladman, where the authority were trying to wriggle out of the existing standard method and the inspector was having none of it. And if these huge figures, particularly across southern England, come in, then, and they do have immediate effect or effect on plans that are more than 5 years old, that is going to be extraordinary. But what we also know is they're contemplating removing the 5-year land supply test. Now that's been a key mechanism for delivering more houses. It's put in the alternative. I would urge everybody to suggest, certainly from the development industry, that it isn't removed. It could be improved. The test for deliverable could be made a lot more simple. The 2 lists that we currently have could be simply 2 defined categories with nothing else and remove the first sentence of the definition of deliverable. But to effectively understand where we are now and what it means for applications, we carry on as normal. We don't know. If they remove the housing delivery, they remove the 5-year land supply test and replace it with housing delivery, presumably they're going to give the authorities 3 years, based on the current situation, 3 years for deciding whether they, or 3 years of results for deciding whether they're behind on their delivery. So this will take time to bed in. The new numbers are not going to take immediate effect, I don't know at the moment, but we wait to see what they say about that and how that graphs onto the current MPPF and when there's going to be a change. I've been asking Steve when the new MPPF's coming out throughout his currency, and he just says to me, be patient. I've asked Simon Gallagher, he says, be patient. I don't know when it's coming out. I think that the thing is, you just carry on as normal. But in terms of promoting sites, obviously, exactly what Thea says, you need to engage in the process. The thing that I welcome the most in all of this, actually, is the reserved sites. I've long been an advocate of reserved sites, and I think that more people will get their sites allocated. There may be reserved sites, but the appeal this week was on safeguarded land in Chorley. They didn't have enough housing, so safeguarded land was released for 180 houses.
So the MPPF is going to need to do a very different job to the current MPPF if it's going to include basically on a national basis development management policies. I mean, how do you see that working, Steve?
Well, they have said, they recognise the MPPF will need to be rewritten, and I suspect that will be the autumn, but that's still a civil servant autumn, Chris. So be patient. And I think that the interesting thing about the rewrite of the MPPF is the suggestion that it will pick up some of the development management policies, and I see there's been a question on that. It's often been a puzzle to me why we've had a system which enables 360 different versions of this is what a side extension should look like, whereas they all say pretty much the same thing, subservient, setback, and so on and so forth, same materials. And there does seem to be scope for some of that to be centralised and so, well, if you're going to have some of these DM policies, I can challenge you now to just randomly pick 2 local plans and look up the same policy. I looked up one recently just on energy efficiency and their approach to climate change. The objective of the policy was exactly the same. One was a paragraph long and one ran to a page and a half. Now you start thinking, well, surely we can try and make some of this more consistent, less variables, less challengeable to all these examinations. And if there's an opportunity to have a set of DM policies which are set nationally, which can be applied across the piece, that seems to me, well, there might be something in that. And of course, the white paper, it says a lot. And I suppose you've got to, this conversation has made me think, yes, I know what it says, but what does it mean? And it's that second question, which is what we're all talking about now. In terms of what it means in terms of DM strategies, development management strategies, I think there's a bit of work to be done between how that will link to the design codes. So if you've got centralized development management policies on things such as extensions and the like, then there seems to me there's going to have to be a read across or an ability for neighborhoods or communities to, through their design codes, to then either influence that or see in the same way the National Design Code is then adopted locally, whether you would have DM policies still be able to be adapted locally. And if that's the case, then I'm not sure what the gain is.
Yeah. Thea, did you have any views?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, we had a comment from Adam Gooch, who is a policy planner at Gloucester City and working on the joint core strategy at the moment. And he said, well, yeah, absolutely. What a great idea to have policies in one national document that then don't have to be repeated, and obviously take on all the nuances that local people want to see within those individual development management policies. So far as the white paper is concerned, I think the two key words are generic and repetitive. We don't want to see generic and repetitive policies that extend the size of local plans and also extend inevitably local plan examinations. But I think it is right. I agree with sort of the alternative proposition that there should be an option for local planning authorities to show exceptional circumstances that necessitate a locally defined approach, because there are going to be some particular local concerns. I have in mind, for example, the countryside protection zone in Uttlesford, which is to do with keeping Stansted Airport as an airport in the countryside that doesn't find reflection in national policy, and I don't think would be caught by any national development management policies, because they would inevitably be much broader. So I agree that sort of with the alternative proposed approach that there should be an option for local planning authorities in exceptional circumstances only to incorporate within their development plans those local approach policies where they're needed.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Thea. Someone asked about the timing, the deadlines for local plans being adopted. Well, the government is saying that local plans will need to be adopted within 30 months of the new legislation taking effect, with an extended period, with that period being extended to 42 months if the authority has a plan which has been adopted in the last 3 years or has been through examination more recently, although when those deadlines precisely kick in is not clear. Now, I'm conscious we're going over our hour, but I wanted to just spend 5 minutes if people would like to stay on, just to go round to invite final short comments from our panelists. And maybe if you've had a chance to scroll through, we've had a huge number of questions which we only managed to touch on, but if maybe in your final comment you can touch on maybe a theme that has come out of the questions. And if I go through people in the same order, so you know who's going to be speaking in what order. Chris, you're on mute, Chris. I love saying you're on mute.
Sorry. Neil Hudson has asked, with much higher numbers for London and the south and lower levels than recent delivery in the north, what does that mean for levelling up? And I think there's a really serious issue there. The procedure they've gone through, the standard method they've gone through, largely based on Savile's method, is very south focused. And the figure for the north of England is only 50,000. That's the 3 regions that make up the north of England, including Manchester and Leeds. Compared with 93,000 alone for London and about 200,000 across the south of England. So the main issue there is in the consultation, there does need to be a proper levelling up. I personally think the numbers could go even higher, because if constraints are going to be applied, then they'll never get to 300,000 on the basis of a target of 337,000. It needs to be something like 380, 400,000. And you can do that by increasing the stock base in the first stage of the standard method. And Neil's absolutely right. The figure in the north needs to go up to about 75, 80,000 a year, so the north can play its part in delivering the houses we need.
Great. Catriona?
I'm going to pick Adrian Fox's question about how should LPAs get white paper ready. And I think, being a little bit cheeky, I would say everybody should start developing their own strategic planning frameworks. Not part of the statutory plan, but there's a huge number of non-statutory frameworks that are being developed, and I think that will put them in a much stronger position to actually have a say over what happens, what the spatial distribution is, and how all that process unfolds. So I'd say if you're not already working with your local authorities, regardless of the fact that duty to cooperate's gone, then I think you should look at a way of getting together and actually start really thinking about how you will deliver a long-term vision for your area and what this new world looks like. One more thing, a shout out for minerals and waste planning, which gets absolutely no mention whatsoever. We'll never be able to deliver 300,000 houses a year if we don't have the materials, and we'll never be able to have sustainable development if we don't have the right waste infrastructure. So hopefully the government actually do address that. It is a hugely important part of the planning system.
Yeah, no thanks. Thea?
Yeah, I mean, for me, my experience of going to planning appeals, hearings and inquiries is that local people are really interested in infrastructure. The biggest complaint is always that the roads are congested and that there isn't enough infrastructure in the locality to accommodate the levels of growth that they've seen, be it, the doctor's surgery, the schools or whatever. I want to know more about infrastructure and how that's going to be delivered, particularly the infrastructure levy, because experience tells us that local authorities are not good at delivering infrastructure. And that was, the findings of the SIL review paper headed by Liz Peace, which came up with some absolutely brilliant recommendations, very few of which were adopted at the time, but basically, the issue I have is if local authorities have the burden of delivering infrastructure alongside all of their new burdens of delivering plans really quickly, etc., is that actually it's going to become a hindrance to development, and big sites are not going to be delivered because you're taking that away from the people, the developers that can actually deliver the infrastructure that's needed to ensure those sites come forward at a reasonably early opportunity.
Great. Duncan?
Yeah, I think I'd do two things. One, just to build on Thea's comment, the white papers mentions infrastructure. In fact, I sad enough to have done a word search. It mentions it 95 times, but it's very much in the context of housing and what's needed to support housing. Not a lot in there on, freestanding transport infrastructure or other infrastructure assets, energy infrastructure and so on. And that relationship between what they're proposing and the, infrastructure industry needs to be clarified more, and I think consultation responses should refer to that. And finally, I'd mention resources. The current system could work a lot better, but it doesn't because of a lack of resources. The new system should work a lot better, but it won't unless resources are there. The white paper acknowledges that, I think, towards the end, but there's very little flesh on the bones, and that really needs a lot more thought.
Yeah. Steve?
I'm not going to pick on one particular question. There's several which touch on issues in the round, really. I mean, we've been talking quite a lot about housing, and that's perfectly understandable. But the link between housing numbers, the delivery thereof, 5-year land supply, and the like, affordable housing. These are issues that, as I said, we read what it says, but we need to know what it means. And I think that those are key issues for me going forward. But there's a broader issue about, if we're going to have placemaking and a chief placemaker, then let's not forget that planning is more than about housing. It is about employment land. It's about open space. It's about the sustainability test, which is coming. The sustainability test is a broader test at the moment, and although the white paper suggests we all know what it means, I think that we'll find that there's a definition of that coming forward in the new NPPF. And in that, then I think that more needs to be said about one of the questions that I've read there is about the whole climate change challenge. And I think one of the questions recognises that some local authorities are going faster on this than the national government appears to be going. And I think that this is an opportunity to try and press for that. And my final point, which is, as time runs out, I go back to those people that have been engaged in the planning service and planning system, who have been championing the voice of localism, irrespective of what you think about neighbourhood plans. The new paper, the white paper, still talks about community engagement. And I still think you've got to reflect on how are we going to ensure that communities are still engaged in this new process, however it lands, and they're still the voice of communities are heard and have influence. Because if they don't still have an opportunity to shape the place where they live, then this idea that planning will become something where that people rejoice and trust will be another pipe dream.
Yeah. Gordon? Yeah, Gordon.
Thanks, Simon. I was trying to find an easier question to answer, but I couldn't go past the one that said what's going to happen in London, because I felt that was quite relevant to me. But I don't think I have an exact answer apart from thinking about it, in that there will invariably be, I think, in sort of lower density areas, the ability to use the new code system for what I sort of would call complying development. But I just think that the innovation and the opt-out points we've discussed that will invariably happen in London, because you will always have in London schemes that won't meet any code. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're not acceptable, but you will still have a need for that. I'd like to think that a new system will help restore faith from the community perspective, because invariably sort of what I've observed is you have a long list of policies in a committee report that no scheme ever complies with, and so decision makers have the choice of either refusing it because it doesn't comply, or on balance accepting that it should be approved. But then the public looks at that and says, well, it's not complying with all these policies, why are you refusing it? And that ties into my sort of earlier sort of issues about mission creep, and actually getting back to land use and appearance, and not putting a smelting plant next to the school. And then my final point is also on resourcing, in that as an ex-local authority planner, I will always say departments need to be properly resourced, but kind of ties into my last point is actually start with giving them less to do, and focus on a sort of a reduced scope. And I guess that's my fear, is that we might come up with this whole new system and it still has all the sort of extra policies in there. So that would be my aspiration.
Great. No, well, thank you everyone. Thank you panelists. Thank you everyone out there, and for all of your questions. I mean, what it strikes me is that the white paper is so broad, with so many proposals that we have to get to grips with quickly to turn into a workable, better system. There was someone who made a very good comment about the fact that they hoped that sessions like this could form part of the consultation process. Unfortunately, they can't. You're going to need to respond separately to MHCLG with your thoughts, but I really hope that between us all and these discussions, we can just help to sort of let the points bed down in our minds a bit and get clearer as to what lies ahead, which can be worrying for some people, can be exciting, and is going to be thought-provoking, that's for sure. So thanks everybody. You'll get a recording of this tomorrow, as I said, and no doubt we'll be seeing each other on screen before long. Bye.
Thank you.